Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to another installment of 40k Fleet Tactics and Strategy, where today we are having a look at the Tau Protection Fleet, the Kor'vattra. Although Protection Fleet is a slightly misleading name, really, as it is also the spearhead for the Tau's expansion into territory that isn't technically theirs to protect. But, well, the Tau mindset on that is quite simply that it isn't technically theirs yet. And so surely there's no reason not to get a good head start on protecting it, now is there? Especially as the Tau fleet, well, it doesn't have the luxury of the Imperium's countless battle fleets, of hanging back and waiting for their layered defense system to tell them exactly what they're up against and how violently to react. Because the Tau fleet simply cannot move as quickly as the fleets of the Imperium, or indeed the fleets of damn near every other major faction in the 41st millennium. Meaning that the Tau need to defend their holdings near immediately, with every sept having its own battle fleet formations, and preferably every world possessing its own immediate local defenses. If at all possible and economically feasible, this will be made up of orbiting void stations, heavily laden with weaponry, protected in turn by screens of local defensive shipping forces, including, in all due likelihood, elements of the Tau merchant fleet. For whilst its primary duty is to carry goods from one world to the other, well, space is awfully dangerous, and weaponry and shields are therefore absolute necessities, allowing the merchant fleet vessels to do stopgap duty as fighting ships when required. And hopefully buy just enough time for the Kor'vattra to move significant forces in to counter any invasion. Or so, at least, the theory goes. As before we can really start talking about the Tau Empire's overall defensive strategy, and much less so its tactics in a direct void engagement, we must address the Tau Empire's greatest weakness in terms of its naval strategy: the relative slowness of their warships. Now, this has been an evolving problem for the Tau Empire ever since the earliest days of its existence. To begin with, when the little blueberries first started reaching out into the galaxy, they did so with the Galileath, or the Explorer class starship. As the name so clearly suggests, this was a vessel whose primary purpose was to explore the daunting, vast emptiness of space and bring back news as to what precisely was out there to the Tau Empire. Bearing in mind that at the time, the Tau were of the opinion that the galaxy was theirs for the taking. The greater good was the single, supreme, and absolute value and entity in the known universe, and every species that they encountered would naturally come to recognize this as well. And so, in many ways, the Galileath was as much a propaganda poster as it was a stellar explorer, as it was a merchant ship, as it was a diplomatic envoy, as it was a ship of war. Which meant that despite its gargantuan size, the equivalent of many imperial capital ships, the Galileath was not particularly good at, well, anything. It had enormous engine arrays powered by behemoth reactors, whose energy output was simply obscene, but even so, it was barely enough to maintain the myriad of city-sized systems aboard the ship, not to mention powering its engines, which, despite their enormity, just weren't very good. They were exceptionally crude, really, and could only propel the ship at about 1/5 of that of equivalent Imperial engines. It was in reality a small miracle that the Tau ever even made it out of their solar system and over to the next one, as the journey must have taken decades. To give you a bit of a frame of reference here, the closest solar system to our own Earth is round about 4 or so light years away, plus minus 2 or 3, meaning that it would take about 4 years whilst travelling at the speed of light to get there. And this, of course, would be impossible for a ship travelling in real space, because it isn't just a question about getting to light speed, it's also a question about decelerating from light speed so that you don't simply just blow through the entire solar system. In other words, you're going to have to spend half of the journey burning as hard as you possibly can, accelerating as much as you possibly can, only so that when you're halfway to the target, you can spin the ship around and start burning the engines the other way, so as to slow down for your arrival in the system. Inconvenient, to say the least, but hey, it was slow, but it was reliable. The Galileaths were getting to where they needed to go, and they were encountering, just as the Tau had always expected, tons of willing and happy populaces more than happy to join up with the Tau Empire in return for their technology and teachings of the greater good. Hey, it's not like the Tau were in any hurry or anything. After all, the entire galaxy, the universe indeed, was simply lying there at their feet, ready to be plucked up. And if bending over to collect the fruits was going to take a few millennia, then, well, so be it. But, of course, this grand ethereal illusion only lasted so long, until the Damocles Crusade rolled along, and the ethereals in their lofty towers realized that those weird little soft-skinned pink things who had claimed to have some kind of empire out there in the void had, if anything, been underselling the scale of their dominion. And had it not been for the fortuitous intervention of the Tyranids, the Tau Empire would likely have been snuffed out then and there under the ever-mounting brunt of an imperial crusade. The Galileath proved themselves to be woefully inadequate to deal with dedicated military vessels. And most crucially of all, far too slow. The single thing above all others that put the fear of the God Emperor into the Tau leadership caste, you see, was not necessarily the innumerable billions of the Imperial Guard, nor the crude yet vast quantities of tanks, or even the Space Marines themselves. It was the Imperium's capability to exterminate the population of entire planets from orbit, even going so far as to destroy the worlds themselves through the process of exterminatus. To the Tau, the destruction of a world was the annihilation of an immeasurable resource, whereas to the Imperium, the destruction of a Tau planet was a light inconvenience, considerably less annoying than the long, drawn-out and bloody ground conflict they would otherwise have to engage in. And if the Tau literally did not have the ability to meet the Imperial fleets anywhere at any time and halt them, well, there was literally nothing stopping the Imperium from simply burning the entirety of the Tau Empire into barren, dead rock. Something was going to have to be done, and quickly, preferably as well. And so the Tau Empire began to explore the ways that the Imperium travelled. Some sort of warp travel, apparently, that allowed their vessels to travel much faster than the Tau had even thought physically possible up until this point. Luckily, there were plenty of, Imperial starships scattered through Tau space at the moment in states of disrepair, shall we say. And as the Tau were far better at reverse engineering than the Imperium is, they managed to figure out the core secrets of the warp drive relatively quickly. What they didn't figure out, however, was the psychic component of the warp drive. They understood the theory that the ship required some sort of guidance system or Geller fields to keep it intact, but they didn't know how they worked. They didn't know how to generate them, and really they had no frame of reference to make it work either. As far as they were concerned, the Earth-caste clan members looked upon it as, well, simple magic, frankly. But even magic can be replicated, at least to a degree, if studied for long enough. And indeed, eventually, the Earth-caste came up with the Ether Drive. This was a sort of pseudo-warp drive, which allowed a vessel to enter into the very uppermost spheres of the immaterium and then be repelled back out again at high speed. This kind of skipping into the immaterium allowed the vessel to reach far, far greater speeds than had been thought theoretically possible up until that point. It was far from a perfect solution, but it was much, much better than their current real space drives, and it allowed the Tau Empire to circumvent the psychic components of full warp drives. This ether drive would eventually become the primary means of propellant used by the protection fleets, as all future warships would need to be equipped with it, or various iterative versions of it as the technology evolved, to be able to rapidly meet invading threats. And due to the Tau's ability to actually upgrade and modify their vessels on an ongoing basis, they have been able to evolve the technology yet further. The top modern ether drives of the current Tau Empire are able to sink into the warp far slower, and also emerge from the warp far slower as well, giving them a longer period of frictionless acceleration, allowing for a much, much higher top speed, to the point that these days Tau vessels are only about half or a third as fast as their Imperial equivalents. There is also a bit of a canon conflict thing I'm going to have to mention here as well, as GW, in their infinite retardation, decided to scrap the idea of the ether drive and the Tau travelling in a sort of pseudo-warpy fashion, and replace it largely with the ZFR Horizon accelerator engine. This was intended, in all due likelihood, to be some sort of alternative and superior version to demonstrate that the Tau Empire is continuously expanding its technological abilities. The problem is that the ZFR Horizon accelerator engine is actually a lot slower than the ether drive, as it is described to be able to bring Tau vessels to close to light speed velocities. Again, I remind you the point that the closest star to our Earth is about 4 light years away. So if we take a look at, say, this map here of the Tau Empire, and we assume, for sake of argument, that we're talking about roughly similar distances. So Elsevier is about 4 light years away from Tau space. Alright? Let's also assume that this brand new magical engine doesn't have the need to decelerate, right? Just for sake of argument. In which case, it would take over 4 years to reach the closest star system from Tau. It would take 3 times that time to get to Tash Var, 4 or 5 again that time to get to Falshar, and maybe 6 times that to get to Burkan. This is obviously unsustainable in any sort of strategic scenario when you're going up against an enemy that can cover the same distance in weeks or months. Now, let's be even more generous, right, and say that there's only a single light year's distance between Tau and Elsyr. Even then, it is going to take a Tau warship 3 to 4 years to reach the outermost extents of the Tau Empire. Still, absolutely unsustainable, unless you're suggesting that the Tau somehow are able to produce the equivalent of entire Imperial battle fleets on each and every single sept and world that they own, which is not very likely, let's face it. So, the ZFR drive thingy, it's very stupid, and I reject it out of hand because it makes way less sense than the ether drive within the universe it exists in. Or, alternatively, we can accept the ZFR aboard the Galileath Explorer-class vessel's replacement ship, the Il Fanor, the Merchant-class ship. These were introduced to take over as the name indicates, the mercantile task of the explorer ships, along with things like diplomatic envoys and general exploration duties. These ships are described as using real space engines rather than the ether drives, but they can reach almost a third of the ether drive's speed. Now, it's still going to take you absolute years to get anywhere, but when you're talking about supply duties and transportation missions, that isn't actually all that unreasonable. The Imperium 2 is serviced by vast quantities of real space transports that do it the good old-fashioned way of speeding off as fast as possible and then spinning around on the halfway mark and decelerating before finally arriving in the system that they are intended to service. So long as you have enough of these ships, the relative slowness of their rate of travel isn't really that big of a problem. The far more pressing concern was, as mentioned, the potential re-emergence of the Imperial Navy, and the need to make sure that there were a lot more purpose-built warships ready to face the next Imperial invasion. And so, the Kor'vattra was initiated. This was to be a Tau Empire-wide enormous shipbuilding program, where a fleet capable of matching the Imperial Navy, or at least the fraction of it that the Tau Empire had actually seen, was to be constructed. This would of course also come along with a major reorganization of the Kor'vattra, as the protection fleet now needed to take on significantly larger duties, and the air caste would have to train a lot more officers in brand new ways of fighting, as whilst some elements of Tau naval strategy had worked out relatively well, it was clear that they were tremendously outclassed by the Imperial Navy in almost every single regard, and measures to copy and counter them were already in the works, with the very first vessel to roll off the assembly line, or the orbital shipyards in this case, being the Larshi class, or Hero. These ships were intended to be the mainstay bulk of the Tau's future navies, and supposed to be the rough equivalent of an Imperial Lunar-class cruiser. This would turn out to be an optimistic expectation, as the Larshi did not live up to expectations. Its armament, its armor, defensive measures, and maneuverability were simply not quite good enough, the Tau still not having fully grasped the necessities of full warships. Oh, it was impressively armed in comparison to previous offerings, sure, but still not enough for the harsh realities of combat in the void. It possessed one gravitic launcher, essentially a series of forward-facing torpedo tubes. It also had a series of railgun batteries in a forward firing arc, as well as left and right-facing ion cannon batteries. Now, these weapon names probably mean absolutely nothing to you, so let me explain them in a bit more detail, especially as the three of them make up the primary mainstay of Tau Void weaponry, and we are going to be mentioning them several times. The gravitic launcher, as already slightly touched upon, is in essence a torpedo launcher, except a pinch more sophisticated and a pinch more compact than the Imperial equivalent. In the case of Imperial torpedoes, they fire absolutely titanic weapons, with, by Imperial standards, relatively sophisticated and effective machine spirit guidance systems, capable of making sure that the torpedo hits its intended target, relying on its sheer bulk and velocity to protect itself against incoming intercept fire. In the case of the Tau gravitic launcher, the torpedoes are far smaller, but guided by a much better guidance system, allowing them to home onto their targets far more reliably and at far greater speed. The increased sophistication of the guidance system also allows the weapon to take defensive actions against incoming fire, allowing it to rely more on speed and maneuverability rather than sheer bulk to survive the occasional intercepting hit. These weapons are also fired from the ship using the gravitic launcher, giving them far greater initial launch velocity than an Imperial torpedo, which is accelerating under its own engine power rather than being shot out of the vessel. Of course, it will have the natural velocity of the ship that fired it as well, but the Tau torpedoes are much faster, allowing them a relatively longer range and the ability to, quite crucially, outrange their Imperial opposition. The railgun batteries, meanwhile, are exactly what they sound like. They are super-sized versions of the weapons used by the Firecast on their various battle tanks and battle suits. It is simply an enormous weapon that fires a projectile using electromagnetic power. This again allows for enormous muzzle velocities, making it a capable weapon even in void warfare scenarios, though bearing in mind any sort of solid slug like this fired at an initial velocity is going to have its effectiveness severely limited by long range, making it primarily a close-range engagement weapon, since if you fire it at a long distance, well, the target's simply not going to be there anymore when the projectile arrives, as even the most rudimentary of evasive maneuvers can place a ship kilometers out of its path when you're talking about the relative velocities involved in void warfare. The railguns of the Tau also require enormous quantities of energy to be charged and fired, and since Tau plasma drive technology is not quite as advanced as that of the Empire, the railguns must be fired one at a time, or otherwise risk overloading the entire system. This has evolved into a ripple fire system where one weapon is fired, then the next, then the next, then the next, then the next, and by the time the final gun has fired, the first will be fully charged, rearmed, and ready to go again, allowing for a consistent and high rate of fire, although it sacrifices the crippling Alpha Strike abilities of the more traditional mass driver guns of the Imperium's warships. And finally, the ion cannons are the Tau Empire's rough equivalents of a lance battery. These three sets of armaments give Tau warships the theoretical ability to fight at long, medium, and short ranges, with their gravitic launchers, ion cannons, and railguns respectively. Although the Tau would prefer to keep the enemy as far away as possible, as their ships are nowhere near as heavily protected as their Imperial opposition, with their hundreds of meters of ablative armoured prows. This too was the lesson that the Tau Empire would slowly come to learn and regret the Larashi class. The Larashi was designed to essentially ape the Lunar-class cruiser. It was intended to be an attempt at an equally versatile ship of the line that could fight at any range with relative equal efficiency. But the problem was that whilst it was able to outrange and outperform the Lunar classes at long range, the moment it got to medium or short-range combat, it simply crumpled like so much tinfoil before a sledgehammer. Clearly, the Tau needed to play more to their strengths and less trying to mimic the Imperium. And so, soon thereafter, the Tau did what they do best and learned their bloody lesson, producing instead the Larashi Protector class cruiser. This design is intended to take ultimate advantage of the Tau's superiority at long range, whilst making sure that if the combat ever gets up close and personal, that it can be settled as quickly as possible. To this aim, it keeps the gravitic launchers of its ill-fated predecessor, but it doubles up on them with 2 forward-facing gravitic launcher batteries. It also has a center-mounted hangar capable of transporting 2 squadrons of Barracudas and Mantas, giving it an extreme range strike capacity in addition to its gravitic launchers. And if the initial wave of firepower is not enough to finish off an opponent, it also carries 3 batteries of railguns, all forward-facing, mounted centrally and in either wing. It forgoes all of the ion cannon batteries in the hope that it can cripple the opponent at long range and then finish the fight at knife-fighting ranges via overwhelming salvos of railgun battery fire. This heavy focus on the offensive role of a cruiser has served this design far better, and it allows it to engage Imperial warships and Orc and Tau vessels on occasion as well in a straight-up fight, without having to try and maneuver into position to utilize parts of its armament like, again, its predecessor. And ideally, it'll never have to get close enough to really engage in all that much maneuvering anyways, as the torpedoes and strike craft should be able to finish off any enemy. And it's also not entirely defenseless, as it has been fitted with extra deflector shields to the fore and the standard Tau gravitational shield technology. Now, this is GW being a bit lazy here, as the gravity shield just acts like any other void shield, frankly, and the deflectors too essentially work just like shields again. A bit boring, as, well, the entire thing of a void shield is that it literally uses the warp to bend energy and transfer parts of it into the immaterium. Surely, if regular shield technology was possible, why wouldn't the Imperium simply double up? Or indeed, triple up? The Imperium knows how to manipulate gravity. There are several weapons that do so, and if a gravitic shield is capable of sending incoming weapons fire out of course, the Imperium should be able to replicate that. Bearing in mind, again, my reverse engineering video. If the Imperium knows that this is theoretically possible, they know that there is a way to adapt human technology to do this thing. Anyways, it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine, but oh well. The Larashi is also equipped with 3 bulbous defensive fire turrets, in the hope of trying to shoot down enemy weapon systems coming for the ship as well. Though, their puny size makes me wonder if they're truly up to intercepting Imperial torpedoes, but oh well. Speaking of as well, I mentioned strike craft here, Barracudas and Mantas. Considering what a key and core part of the overall void warfare strategy of the Tau these are, I should probably give you a little bit more information about them. Starting with the Barracuda. The Barracuda is originally intended to be an air superiority fighter, with both atmospheric and void-faring capabilities. Now, for an atmospheric fighter, the Barracuda is hilariously heavily armed, coming with a nose-mounted ion cannon, an enormous power weapon, along with multiple missile pods with Seeker missiles and 2 wing-mounted burst cannons with the ability to intercept incoming weapons as well. But for a Void fighter, it is hilariously underarmed. It's actually a bit weird that the Tau Empire haven't come up with something better, really. Instead, they are clinging to this multi-purpose sort of design. Again, don't get me wrong, for an air superiority fighter in an atmospheric contest, the Barracuda is insane. It vastly outclasses its Imperial equivalents of, say, for example, a Lightning, in terms of armaments, in terms of mobility, in terms of armor, in terms of literally everything. But put the Barracuda up against a Fury Void superiority fighter, and you've got the exact opposite scenario. The Fury is 5 to 6 times the length of the Barracuda, and carries over half a dozen las cannon, plus Seeker missiles, plus multi-laser defense batteries. Never mind the las cannons. If the Barracuda gets within range of the secondaries of a Fury interceptor, it'll be turned into so much spinning debris in a millisecond. It really is an absolutely awful matchup, but hopefully, for the Tau that is, their Seeker missiles will level the playing field somewhat, as they are in all due likelihood better at finding a target than the Imperial Seeker missile equivalents. But again, bearing in mind that the Fury is many, many times the size of the Barracuda, it can undoubtedly carry a hell of a lot more missiles as well. Now, of course, the Fury Interceptor isn't the only attack craft employed by the Imperial Navy. It is mostly deployed from capital ships, carriers, grand cruisers, battleships, etc., whereas the smaller ships will usually carry complements of Lightnings or Thunderbolts. They would be a far closer match for the Barracuda, but still, that would be at best a close-run thing, whereas the Fury would almost certainly absolutely dominate the Barracuda. And that is a problem because the Barracuda's very role is, of course, to establish void superiority in the case of our spaceborne battles, and to protect the wings of Manta bombers. The Manta, previously known as the Manta Missile Destroyer, is the Tau Empire's primary strategic strike aerial weaponry, and the best opposition the Tau Empire has to Titans and Gargants and Bio-Titans and the like. Now, in my opinion, there is no way in everlasting hell this thing is really a competitor to a Titan, but, well, the fluff tells us it has significant plot shielding, so let's just accept that for what it is. As the Manta actually carries a energy shield, which is apparently the equivalent of a Titan's void shields. Alrighty then, if indeed you say so. It also possesses 2 forward-facing heavy railguns. These are not quite as potent as the void ship equivalents, but they are very powerful weapons. Again, I doubt their capabilities against Titans, but let the bone go, Mr. Dog. And also a dozen burst fire cannons for point defense and strafing capabilities. But probably its main offensive punch comes in the form of its massive missile bay, capable of carrying up to 10 Seeker missiles. These can be guided onto a target either by Marker-Light-equipped troops or vehicles on the ground, or by the Manta's own onboard Marker-Light systems, allowing it to essentially laze a target and then hit it with high-precision ordnance. There is also a further variant of the Manta with 2 triple ion cannon batteries as well. This would probably be the variant more adeptly suited for void warfare, as the Manta, whilst being able to bring an absolutely hilarious amount of firepower to an atmospheric engagement, again falls dreadfully short of the Imperial standard for strike craft. Even with 2 heavy railguns or 2 triple ion cannon batteries, along with the 10 Seeker missiles, well, this is enough firepower to bother a light Imperial destroyer. It might even be enough to annoy a frigate, but it's going to be utterly worthless against any sort of ship of the line. Even less so against the capital vessel, it'll be practically worthless. And again, a Fury Interceptor will chew through this thing like it's damn near nothing, and the burst cannons are gonna have a very hard time fighting against it effectively in the void. And when you compare it to the Imperial bombers, like, for example, the rather enormous Starhawk, it is simply not in the same class. Again, you really would think that the Tau would have developed some form of heavy strike craft by now, with the ability to carry dedicated anti-ship weaponry, rather than continuing to use these kind of multi-role weapons. Though, to be fair, they have also developed something of a middle-of-the-road kind of solution, allowing the Mantas and Barracudas to be kept primarily for atmospheric operations, where their gunships are used for void engagements, as there are 2 more ship classes I need to talk to you about, and so we might as well start with aforementioned gunship, the Kir-La, or Warden class. This is a rather adorable little thing, and for once, a nice little deviation from simply just making the same thing that the Empire has, but in a slightly different design philosophy and, looking like a fish or something. For you see, this is not actually a fully void-capable warship. It doesn't have much in the way of life-sustaining systems, it can't travel for its own or any real extended period, and it has very little, if anything, in the way of long-range engine capabilities. Instead, it is, quite literally, towed along after other Tau warships via a gravitic hook. Some Tau craft can carry up to 2 of these things, or more correctly, tow 2 of them, and many merchant ships have also been known to tow along 1 gunship for close-range escort and protection. Now, during travel, the gunship is not actually occupied. It is only crewed when they are entering into combat, so if it needed to be ejected or if it was destroyed early, it wouldn't take the crew with it. The crew also wouldn't be able to live on the ship for extended periods of time, so that's necessary to take in mind as well. But this provides the Tau Empire with a sort of ultra-heavy strike craft capability, as it is armed with forward-firing railguns and ion cannon batteries, making it the rough equivalent of a sword-class frigate, roundabout. The sword is probably a pinch on the heavier side, maybe a Cobra class. Yes, it would be a decent matchup against a couple of Cobra-class destroyers, definitely, and it would most certainly be able to tear apart Furies or Starhawks, although the Warden does lack truly dedicated anti-ship capabilities. A railgun and an ion cannon is all well and good, and it's certainly a hell of a lot more than the Barracuda and the Manta can boast, but it is, at the end of the day, a heavy strafing strike craft, meant to potentially engage enemy heavy interceptors or frigates or light destroyers, rather than big vessels. And again, I feel like that is a missed opportunity for the Tau with their hyper-advanced Seeker warhead technology in particular. Nevertheless, it is a very cool idea and an interesting deviation from the usual types of void warfare in 40k. Finally then, we're going to have a look at the Galileath, the Custodian class battleship. Custodian. Well, that's a name I feel like the Imperium might take personal offense from, but oh well. The Custodian is the first true battleship, the first true capital warship produced by the Tau Empire. And they are not making a lot of them. They are ludicrously expensive, to the point where they are immeasurably valuable, and the loss of even a single one would be a serious blow to the Tau Empire at large. But in return, they do possess strike capabilities far in excess of any other Tau vessel. It carries with it the equivalent firepower of 2 or 3 cruisers worth of railgun batteries, in addition to medium-range ion cannon batteries, and obviously several launchers worth of gravitic launcher weaponry as well. It also carries with it launch facilities for 3 squadrons of Barracudas and Mantas, and it has a centrally mounted hangar for 3 Warden gunships. It also carries with it the long-range coordination and control systems required to launch, maintain communication with, and guide to target all of these long-range strike capabilities offered to it by its Barracudas, Mantas, and gunships, allowing it to be both a carrier and a battleship at the same time. And in any one-to-one engagement would probably be able to overwhelm most Imperial warships with waves upon waves of missile weaponry, ion cannon fire, railgun batteries, and attacks from multiple directions by smaller strike crafts and the gunships. It would be a lethal adversary for any Imperial cruiser, and would be more than a match for most Grand Cruisers as well, though it fails to live up to the full weight class of an Imperial capital battleship, as its enormous firepower would be an extraordinary threat to an Galileath, and one that the Tau captain would be extraordinarily hesitant to expose his ship to, as there aren't all that many of them. And, in all due likelihood, these battleships would prefer to carry out a hit-and-run style activity when faced up against major Imperial warship opposition, picking off easier prey, and using its long-range strike abilities to harass the larger prey. And now that we've covered all of the warships and the weaponry, it's time to finally get on to some strategy and tactics. So, the primary strategic concern must necessarily dictate tactics, especially as the Tau Empire does not have the luxury of dictating when, where, and how most void battles are going to be fought, as they are simply not able to outmaneuver most of their expected enemies, with the potential exception of the Tyranids, but, well, they're hardly known for their maneuvering strategy or tactics either way, as both the Imperium and Orcs, the 2 other primary enemies of the Tau Empire, have access to warp drive technology that the Tau simply cannot match. Indeed, if we look at the map of the Tau Empire, as I did previously, and we see the amount of time that sublight travel would take them to go anywhere, well, any conflict is likely to be over long before a single warship ever arrives, meaning that the Tau Empire will have to rely on sizable local garrisons. Now, the very first line of defense, as mentioned, would be the merchant fleet, which would still have a fair few Galileath explorer vessels still in their midst, in addition to the newer Il Fanor merchant class ships. Now, the Explorer is already designed, at least to a degree, for combat operations, so it's still got a fairly nasty bite. As for the Ilfanor, it is mostly a merchant ship, but it has been designed in such a way as to be relatively easily modifiable into a relatively heavily armed ship. Again, its shielding, its defensive measures, and armor, and its armament as well, will never match up to that of a proper warship, but it can absolutely make up a decent stopgap measure. Furthermore, both are able to be modified with gravitic hooks to carry Kirla Warden-class gunships along with them, providing significant extra punch to a small-level fleet engagement. Incidentally, I didn't bring up the specific ship class because, really, it's not that important in the grand scheme of things, but the Tau Empire does have access to some destroyer and rough frigate equivalents in the form of the Sketer Khan, the Messenger-class starships. Now again, these are not really properly militarized vessels, but they're, sort of very heavy attack crafts, destroyer frigate equivalents that are available in some numbers to the Tau Empire, presumably enough to be available along with the merchant shipping as the initial line of defense. Now obviously, these non-mainline combatants are not going to be standing up to any sort of determined assault for any real period of time. They are merely there to buy time for a proper response. Ideally, they will operate alongside defensive void platforms equipped with massed batteries of railguns and missile weapons. And even then, they will be acting primarily as a deterrent. They will try to make sure that the enemy needs to deploy in ready combat line formation well outside of their weapon's effective range, meaning that they will have to close the distance in real space, which costs time and preparations as well. The Tau would then try, if possible, to launch skirmishing attacks against the enemy, trying to drag them off and bring individual vessels into one-on-one duels with the Tau ships, who will, in all due likelihood, be able to maneuver together far more effectively, as they have access to way better communications technology than either the Imperium or the Orcs. Against the Tyranids, this would be an exceptionally risky strategy, one likely to backfire catastrophically, something the Tau Navy did learn, much to its regret, later on as well. But against Orcs in particular, drawing elements off from the main wave will almost certainly be very, very effective. But again, this initial defense line is all but guaranteed to be overrun, and in the worst case scenario, outright annihilated. But so long as they succeed in purchasing enough time for the proper Protector fleet to arrive, then that is worth it. Now, the bulk of the Protector fleets should be made up of the La Chivray cruisers. However, they are very expensive ships to build. They are far more complicated than their predecessors and are not available in significant numbers yet. And so the mainstay of the Tau fleet is likely to be the older La Shi, the Hero-class cruiser. These older vessels are of limited usefulness against the Imperial Navy, but with numbers and coordination they can provide a relatively significant front line, particularly in coordination with their better La Chivray cousins. And against enemies like the Orcs, well, they'll certainly provide more firepower against an enemy that can't coordinate quite as well. Although it was precisely against the Orcs that the shortcomings of the La Shi, the hero class, was made apparent, as they simply didn't have enough firepower to stop the Orcs from closing to point-blank range and start launching mass point-blank battery bombardments and torpedo pods. usually both at the same time, overwhelming whatever point defenses the Larshi might have boasted about. Regardless, the task of both cruiser classes will be to defend the heavy assets, the Galileath battleships, as they're the ones providing the main killing power. Now, not all Tau Steps are going to even have access to the battleship classes, but most will hopefully at least have one regional capital. And here's the thing as well, the Tau will not be able to rush piecemeal reinforcements to an area like the Imperial Navy is able. The Imperial Navy is happy to dispatch even individual squadrons of destroyers, frigates, and cruisers with the expectations that heavier elements will join them later, whenever they can be found and assigned to a significant battle group, because they can travel through the warp. For the Tau, however, this would potentially be suicidal, as if they begin drip-feeding their forces into battle, they are going to be overwhelmed and destroyed. Though there is a delicate balance to be struck here. Due to their superior long-range engagement capabilities, the Larashivre, the Protector class, for example, with its Barracuda and Manta strike craft, and potentially also the gravitic hook-mounted gunships and its own missile pods, have the ability to be an excellent skirmisher. Indeed, one of the greatest successes of just this class was during the earliest Imperial invasions, when they managed to run amok amongst Imperial transport shipping, severely delaying Imperial military ground operations in the process. These kind of hit-and-run tactics would be the preferred battlefield or void tactic employed by the Tau, but here's the problem: skirmishing requires ground. Or more correctly, in this case, space. Space that can be surrendered without fatal consequences. And if you're protecting a major sept world from an incoming exterminatus, you might not have the ground to spare. So the very first strategic decision that a Tau commander must make is whether or not he has the space, the ground required to engage in skirmishing tactics. If he does, then rushing an initial contingent of cruisers onto the scene to begin launching raids against the enemy and seeing if they can't peel away important resources or ships, or perhaps even corner important enemy combatants. Or, if he needs to wait for his whole fleet to arrive and engage the enemy in a pitched last-stance defense, will be a crucial decision. Ideally, both elements will arrive simultaneously, as even in skirmish, the more firepower you can bring to bear, the better. Ideally, a whole Tau battle fleet will be able to engage with light frigate and gunships at the fore, reaching out and engaging with enemy strike crafts, frigates, and destroyers to keep them away from the larger vessels, whilst they send off their Barracudas and Mantas to further harass enemy ships and strike craft as missile volleys streak towards the enemy's capital ships in an effort to overwhelm them, or at the very least to make them withdraw and expose the softer ships alongside them. This means that the Tau would not be fighting so much in a line as they would in a nice big box formation, making sure that as many of their ships' weapons could be fired simultaneously as possible in an effort to overwhelm enemy defenses with sheer numbers of incoming weapons. This is particularly useful as well when you need to overload void shields. And if it is indeed a unified offensive, then the Custodian class battleships, the Galileath as well, could join in, both with its firepower providing medium-range lancers and, most crucially, long-range strike craft. Ideally, you would never get within ion cannon range in this phase. You would simply want to shadow the enemy fleet, launching repeated missile barrages and strike craft at them before retreating at maximum speed, which can be a dodgy strategy against the Orcs and their overcharged engines, but against the Imperium's relative real space sluggishness, it has proven to be a valuable tactic previously. And honestly, so long as this distance can be maintained so long as the skirmishing can be kept going, the Kor'vattra will be in its element, and will be more than happy to engage damn near any opponent. The problem is when they are bound to an objective. Any Tau admiral would want to keep his fleet at maximum range for all eternity, as there is plenty of space in, well, space. The problem is when there's a Tau planet to be protected. The Tau do not think like the Imperium when it comes to ground gained or captured. They don't necessarily value the planet in and of itself, but they do value its population and its industrial potential, and the planet itself as a base of resources and livelihood. They cannot simply abandon a world, particularly not a populated one, meaning that if the Imperium or the Orcs are able to threaten one, the protection fleet will have no choice but to stand and protect it. And this is where things start getting really dicey, because no longer will the fleet be able to rely on its long-range firepower alone. It would, in all due likelihood, form up again in an enormous box formation, so as to be able to fire as many weapon systems as possible, as continuously as possible, against the advancing enemy, whilst slowly retreating themselves, as of course the planet is not a do-or-die objective necessarily. You can keep the skirmishing going, because to deploy exterminator's weaponry or to launch a planetary invasion, ships will need to enter into stable orbit above the planet, a very dangerous maneuver that can be made suicidal or straight up impossible by the presence of enemy warships in the area. So it's not like they have to stand in front of the planet or anything, but they've got to be in the vicinity, in weapons range, and with the ability to see the enemy. They can't cede one half of the planet, for example, because even the Tau can't arc weapons around planets all that easily. Especially not in the face of enemy point defenses and interceptors and void superiority fighters, etc. In these circumstances, the Tau would still want to try and pick away isolated elements of the advancing enemy fleet, utilizing their Barracudas and Mantas to overrun the enemy's picket lines and threaten their larger warships, perhaps even turning a flank or overwhelming them with gunships, which would, of course, infiltrate alongside the missiles to create a cornucopia of targets for enemy defensive firepower, with the idea that some of it is bound to get through. Due to the Tau Empire's superior communications technology, they would also probably find it far easier to target individual warships, and in these cases, crippling them and forcing them out of the assault is just about as good as actually destroying them, as every gun taken out of consideration when it comes to pounding the now stationary Tau fleet is a tremendous victory, and a crippled warship is unlikely to be able to outrun the range of the Tau. Nevertheless, though, this is an absolute last case scenario, as the Tau fleet is likely to be absolutely savaged in the process of fighting the enemy toe to toe, and the Tau Empire cannot afford casualties like the Imperium or the Orcs, or, God Emperor help them, the Nids can. They would always prefer to skirmish with the enemy, to draw them away from the planet, to make sure that they don't have to stand and fight, because if they do, they are going to take losses, and there is virtually no way to avoid it, as the moment they are pinned down, they are a boxer with a glass jaw, and one seriously good hit might not even just destroy a planet's defenses, it might cripple an entire sector of Tau space. Particularly when one takes into consideration how long it will take to move up reinforcement ships. If the Tau Empire is ever decisively defeated in a battle, that area of space is as good as surrendered to the enemy. Though, on the flip side, it does also mean that if the Tau are ever on the offensive, oh, they can be an exceptionally annoying enemy to deal with. Because if they have no objective to be nailed down to, because they're the ones attacking, there is no reason why the Tau fleet can't simply just flit around, firing long-range salvo after long-range salvo in perpetuity. This is, of course, where strike fighters and faster, smaller ships become exceptionally dangerous, but the Tau have equipped their vessels with a fair bit of point defense intercept capabilities, in the form of defensive missile batteries and point defense burst cannons as well, minimizing the danger of Cobra-class destroyers or sword frigates or Fury and Starhawk bombers getting a bit too close. And regardless of the risk, again, the Tau would prefer to be on the offensive where they can't be nailed down as easily, particularly considering the dangers that defense might pose. Again, due to the time it takes to reinforce any sector of the Tau Empire, if they are forced into a do-or-die situation, they might very well be boned on a very large scale, making attack, indeed, the best form of defense. And that just about wraps it up. The Tau Empire, its ships, its weapons, its tactics, and its strategies. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.